Hi, everyone. Welcome to Refuge, Rights, and Refusal, a conversation with Lamis Abdelaaty and Rebecca Hamlin. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Vanessa Olguin. I'm a senior majoring in government in the College Scholar program, and I'm minoring in migrations. I'm a part of this year's cohort of Migration Scholars, a fantastic group of undergraduates passionate about migration studies and research in collaboration with the New Migrations Initiative. Thank you to Cornell University's Migrations Initiative for hosting this discussion. The Interdisciplinary Initiative studies how all living things migrate from place to place on our planet, and you can engage with more of this work through upcoming activities this semester. Thank you also to the Department of Government and the Center for the Study of Inequality for sponsoring this discussion today. As we begin today's program, I would like to first acknowledge the land on which we are on today. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayohono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayohono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayohono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayohono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. This acknowledgement does not exist in the past tense or historical context, but with the recognition that colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build mindfulness around our present participation. For today's event, Professor Abdelaaty and Hamlin will present from their new books, which will then be followed by responses from Ian Kysel of the law school and Dr. Chiara Galli in sociology. The event will be moderated by Dr. Rachel Riedel, who will be introducing the speakers and the discussants. Now, I'm excited to introduce Professor Rachel Riedel, who is the John S. Knight Professor of International Studies, Director of the Abdelaaty Center for International Studies, and Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. Her research interests include institutional development in new democracies, local governance and decentralization policy, authoritarian regime legacies, and religion and politics with the regional focus in Africa. Riedel is co-host of the podcast Ufahamu Africa, featuring weekly episodes of news highlights and interviews about life and politics on the African continent.
Thank you everyone so much for being here, for joining us today. On behalf of the Global Cornell's Migration Initiative and the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, I'm so pleased to welcome you all and thank you very much for joining us, and a special welcome to our speakers today. As Vanessa has mentioned, this is part of the Migrations Initiative, which is Cornell University's first global grand challenge. Several of our co-chairs and task force leaders are here, Shannon Gleason and Eric Tagliacoso. And we're so thankful to all of our members across the university for coming together and really leading this interdisciplinary initiative to think about the migration and mobility of people, things, animals, microbes, ideas, right? And the ways in which our interconnectedness shapes possibilities for past, present, and future. So today is one of our series of events to focus on this theme, and we invite you to join, to sign up, to subscribe to our newsletter, events listings, to follow us on Twitter, right? To stay engaged in the conversation so that you can continue to be a part of it. We have a weekly forum of works in progress, continuing set of speaker series on these events. And so it's really a strong intellectual community, and we're very grateful for your interest. Today, I'm especially pleased to welcome Rebecca Hamlin and Lamis Abdelaaty as our featured speakers. And I'll start with the introductions. And I also wanted to make 2 procedural logistical notes. We're able to offer an online virtual streaming option. So that means that during the presentations themselves, if the audience could please make sure we're on mute in terms of what comes across on the speakers, that would be really appreciated. Thank you so much. And also a huge thank you to Eleanor Painter, our postdoctoral fellow of the Migrations Initiative, for organizing this incredible specific event and also the broader set of speaker series throughout the academic year. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for all your work and intellectual leadership in doing so, and also to the Migrations Initiative team who put this together. Huge thanks to you as well. in particular to our PSAC colleagues in the Department of Government and all of our students who are here. So Rebecca Hamlin, our first speaker, is an associate professor of legal studies and political science at the University of Massachusetts. She received her PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley in 2009. And her research is focused on law and immigration politics with a particular interest in migrant categorization and the concept of a refugee. Her published work has examined how the United States and other liberal democracies use administrative agencies and courts to adjudicate migration and citizenship questions, and the political response to judicial involvement in migration matters. She is the author of 2 books, Let Me Be a Refugee from 2014 and from Oxford University Press, and Crossing, How We Label and React to People on the Move, which was recently published 2021 from Stanford University Press. Her presentation will be followed by Lamis Abdelaaty, who is an assistant professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University and senior research associate at the Campbell Public Affairs Institute. Her interests include international relations, human rights and humanitarianism, and asylum and migration. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the American Philosophical Society, and her articles have appeared or are forthcoming in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Journal of Refugee Studies, Political Studies, International Interactions, and the International Journal of Human Rights. Abdelaaty holds a doctoral degree in politics from Princeton University. We're so pleased to have these 2 speakers here with us today in conversation with each other and in conversation with our discussants and in conversation with all of our audience members. So Rebecca, with you. Thank you so much.
Do I click something to make it appear? Awesome. Thank you very much. I don't know if the clicker is working. I'm just not pointing it at the right thing. Okay. Sorry, that might be easier. Is that okay? Is there a double mic situation going on? Yeah. Okay, so I don't need this one. At the clicker. You don't want to stop sharing. When the people are there. We'll get this all worked out and then it'll be worked out for you.
I think you have to go back to PowerPoint.
Perfect. So maybe this does work.
Yeah.
I do need the mic. Do you have the mic? This guy? I think we're all sorted now. Thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure everything was going to work before I started talking. Hello. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to have my first visit to Cornell University. It's very beautiful, and I'm particularly excited to be sharing the podium, if you will, with Dr. Abdelaaty, with whom I've been in conversation now for about 8 years on these topics. So this is a really fun way to formalize that ongoing conversation. So I'm really excited to talk to you about my new book today. And I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about why I decided to write this book. And the real sort of beginning seed, I've been interested in this topic for much longer than this, but I really started thinking about it in this way. In the summer and early fall of 2015, when you may remember that lots and lots of people, perhaps an unprecedented number of people, were crossing into Europe in many cases by sea or over land in other cases. Many of them were fleeing the civil war in Syria, and other people were coming from many other parts of the world. But the European governments and the European public in general were shocked, taken aback, overwhelmed, many different reactions to this. And there was this flurry of explainer articles that sort of took over the news media for several weeks, and all of them followed the exact same format, which was to ask this question: what is the difference between a migrant and a refugee? Really, with the underlying question being, what are the people who are coming to Europe? Which one are they? And the even more underlying question being, because it matters which one they are, because that helps us decide how much we should care and how much obligation we have to these people. That was more of the unspoken question that seemed to be driving these articles. And all of them followed the same format, which was to ask the question, say that the question was extremely important, and then provide the definition of a refugee from international law, and then say some of the people coming across are refugees and the rest of them are migrants. And then that's the end of the article, right? So I don't know about you, a lot of you are probably students right now. That doesn't teach very much, right? That doesn't teach you how to actually answer the question of what do we owe to the people who are very clearly coming, whether they are a refugee or not. And so I became very frustrated with these articles, and I called my friend and colleague at the time, Lamis Abdelaaty, and complained about this with her and vented, and we agreed, and we ended up writing this piece for the Washington Post monkey cage blog about how this is the wrong question to be asking. And from there, I began to really just dive deeper and deeper into this question. And I ended up framing it as, framing the problem that I had been observing as one of binary logic. Binary logic, thinking of every single person crossing a border is either a migrant or a refugee. And that's really what this book is about. It's about the history and genesis of the migrant refugee binary, and then also sort of the current lives and homes of that binary. So let me just give you a little bit more detail about what I mean when I say binary logic. So first and foremost, the migrant refugee binary has major discursive features. So that's part of why I'm interested. You see it everywhere. And I apologize to those of you who hadn't thought of it in this way before. You can't unsee it once you see it. You'll probably read coverage of migration differently now, because it really does have a lot of prevalence in public debate about border crossing, in advocacy strategies, and also, this is a big part of the book that I won't probably get to today, the way that scholars approach our study of border crossing. And it's based on sort of three core assumptions that I talk about in the three pillars of binary logic. The first and foremost is the assumption that migrants and refugees have distinct and distinguishable motivations for crossing borders. So that not only are people coming across for two quite different sets of reasons, but that is actually possible to create, for a state to create a bureaucratic structure, a system of regularized inquiry that sorts the people, right? That accurately, efficiently, predictably, and justly sorts migrants from refugees in an ongoing way. The second core assumption coming off of that is that's important to do because that process helps us identify who the neediest amongst border crossers are. So the sorting process is one of identifying the people who are of most need and are most deserving of our care and concern and protection. The third assumption is that true refugees are rare. So what we're really doing is finding the people amongst a large group of people that are deserving of the most care and attention. And throughout the book, I talk about how these three assumptions really go together and feed upon each other. And also about how these assumptions are all three problematic, flawed, and not as clear cut as you might think. So the other really important thing that I think you need to know about binary logic going into this is that I view it as in a very essentialist way of looking at human beings. So it's based on this belief that every individual person, that there's like a true answer to the question of whether or not they are a refugee. And so this process of regularized inquiry that I've mentioned is one of discovery, right? It's one of actually discovering the truth of the matter, which is whether or not this individual person possesses the quality of refugee-ness, right? And people who subscribe to this essentialist logic are going to believe that a refugee possesses this quality, whether it's discovered or not, right? They already possess it before they enter into a sorting process. And if they're sorted incorrectly, they will still possess it. And that's a very important part of binary logic. Okay, so let's dive in a little more. The basic argument is that the empirical study of border crossers, and on this in the book, I rely a lot on other people's work, fantastic scholars that have gone out there and empirically studied border crossers. In some cases, I rely on my own work. But empirical study, of which there is much, reveals the binary to be a legal fiction. It actually doesn't map onto reality very well at all. And legal fiction is a concept from my interdisciplinary field of law and society. And what it really means is a legal fiction is a construction, right? It's something that isn't necessarily accurate, but we use it almost like a shorthand, right? It's a term of art that is used for purposes of bureaucratic expediency and convenience, right? It helps us to get to a goal, even if it fudges the truth a little bit. And that's to me, a very accurate way of describing what we're doing here when we're trying to sort. Instead of buying into binary logic in the book, I try to use a critical refugee studies lens. And by that, I mean, I'm really focused on geopolitical power dynamics, right? So what are the most powerful actors in the world and how do they exert that power? And also a post-colonial and colonial legacy lens, right? Thinking about the way in which the world has been structured historically around empire. And I draw on and build a framework of all of these fantastic scholars that I identify as being part of that tradition. And I find in the end that the migrant refugee binary is very good at obscuring. It masks the ways in which categories have been politically constructed over time to elevate the suffering of some people over the suffering of others, to focus our attention and care and concern on some forms of life and suffering over others. And so in the book, as I mentioned, I actually take kind of a very broad brush world tour view, and there's chapters looking at this from lots of different angles that I can't go into today, but for the little bit of time we have remaining, I'll just do a little bit of a deeper dive into just one of the actors in the system. Maybe one that you wouldn't suspect. You might suspect who's really invested in this. Well, states, right? Governments who are processing people are really invested in this. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about one that might surprise you more, which is UNHCR. And UNHCR is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They are the agency that is under the auspices of the United Nations that's tasked with refugee protection around the world. And they have a very large social media presence, lots of Twitter followers, lots of Facebook followers, lots of Instagram followers, and you'd even possibly be surprised to learn Pinterest. They've got a Pinterest page, still not clear on why. But here, so I started following them more closely on social media and actually built a database of all of their tweets over a couple of years. And they're very active. And they tweet stuff like this all the time. And always it's linked to like literally the same article, which is the explainer piece, right? It always goes back to, if you're confused, let us explain this to you. Here's the legal definition of a refugee. So for example, you may all remember the very famous, very disturbing viral photo that went around of a little toddler boy named Alan Kurdi, who was photographed dead on a beach in Greece. The morning after that photo went viral, UNHCR tweeted, refugee or migrant, what is right? Right, so they were helping to jump into that moment with some clarification around legal definition. But it's been an ongoing topic of interest, to say the least, for UNHCR over years. March 2016, there's a crucial difference. Learn more. Click to this link. Confused about who's a refugee and a migrant? Our FAQs will help. So they feel very, very focused on trying to explain to people that there is a difference. So I started getting more and more interested in how they present themselves to the world. And this is not a new thing. This is actually predates social media. So what I learned was in 2005, the director of protection, which is the main work that UNHCR does, wrote an article called "Refugees Are Not Migrants," arguing that it's actually dangerous to blur these categories because refugees are a very specific type of border crosses that should not be thought of as a subcategory of migrant. This goes on, obviously, in 2017, the Assistant Commissioner for Protection is saying something very similar. He actually goes on into more detail, saying it's inappropriate to present refugees as a subset of anyone else. The person who is a refugee is a refugee. There's the essentialism. Full stop. Blurring the distinction between refugees and migrants undermines the specific legal protections to which refugees are entitled. So you get the sense that they see it as a very important part of the work that they do to emphasize this distinction and to really promote, protect, and advocate for a binary logic. This photo is one of the pieces of my data collection that really kind of stopped me in my tracks. This is from the 2007 cover of Refugees magazine, which you may or may not subscribe to, but it is the magazine of UNHCR. And as you can see on this cover, it's a very, very striking image, a disturbance of a Black man clinging to a lifeboat, and there's white people in the boat, presumably about to pull him out of the boat. That's what we assume here. And so it's this possible moment of rescue at sea. Looks like the Mediterranean. But then superimposed over the image is this question, refugee or migrant, why it matters. And I don't know about you, but it really struck me when I first came across this image that was just about the last question that I had in my mind about that moment, sort of the least important thing about that moment. But then if you know a little bit more about the dynamics of the Mediterranean, you know that this person, once pulled into the boat, will be subjected to a refugee status determination, this process of inquiry that I've already mentioned, and very likely not to be a refugee. Right? So the moment of rescue is made more ambiguous by that contextual knowledge, but also by this question, right, which helps emphasize just how deeply invested UNHCR is in the binary. Here's another example, because I can't help myself. I just find this really funny. UNHCR calls these the French fry guys. They like them very much. And they often do this kind of thing. This is from Instagram. Who is a refugee and who is a migrant? And then the follow-up is, mixing these terms can cause problems, but we aren't really told what the problems are. But that's more implied in this presentation. And that's from February of 2019. There's a lot of this. I could have showed you more, but we'll sort of leave it at that. What I decided to do after doing this deep dive into both the UNHCR social media and also their public statements and their media reports and releases, press releases, I decided I needed to go there and find out more about why they're so invested in this binary. For what purpose, right? What is the answer? And I could go into lots of sort of like political science literature to help understand global governance institutions and how they operate. And I do that in the book. But for today, I'm just going to share with you some of my thoughts. So I spent a week at UNHCR headquarters. They were very generous, invited me in. I spent a whole week with the social media and communications team, shadowing them like 9 to 5, going to cafeteria, having tea and lots of coffee with them all day long. And I had some really great conversations, in many cases, multiple times, with the people in charge of UNHCR's communications and social media strategies. And so this is the background I was given. One of them told me around 2014, 15, we gained an awareness that we have a different role to play. We have always done quiet advocacy, diplomacy with governments, but we realized we needed to be more present at the grassroots level to be a trusted voice. We don't have a presence in the West on the ground like we do in some countries. So this, the social media, was a way to have presence. When they say they invested in it, they really invested in it. They hired tons of new staff. They did massive amounts of social media training for existing staff. They have people in all their field offices tasked with just doing social media. It's a big deal for UNHCR. It's in their strategic plan. They spent a lot of money on this. And the goal seems to be to reach us, right? To reach people in the global north with social media accounts. We do a lot of really strategic outreach based on a lot of research. A huge part of it is dispelling stereotypes with stories. So we know that there's hostility and xenophobia, and we want to tell stories about how refugees are integrating, working, learning the language, getting involved in their community. So this helps us understand a little bit more. The goal is to make people in wealthy democracies, global north states, donor states, less scared of refugees, more open and more willing to let them come because they're painted as non-threatening. And then this third person said, we know we need explainers. I asked, like, why do we do so many of these explainers? They said, we know we need them because of the questions that come in on the comments. There's a lot of confusion about definitions. We think a lot about the anxious middle, which is such a helpful study, and about reachable audience. So the anxious middle was a study based in the UK where the authors basically found there's a tiny few people on the one end of the spectrum who are like, I love refugees, bring them in. And then a few people on the other end of the spectrum who are like, never, we don't want anyone. But the vast majority of public, the people in wealthy donor states, have a more ambiguous perspective on this. They're like, well, I'd be open to it, but I'm a little bit worried about X, Y, and Z, maybe economic factors, maybe they have a concern about cultural differences. And this is who UNHCR thinks that they can reach and persuade. And it's very important to UNHCR to feel like they can reach these people and say, don't worry, refugees aren't bad, they're not scary, they won't change your everyday life. It's okay to support bringing them to your country. And this is like such a big driving force, especially because of, so I did these interviews, obviously you can see during the Trump years, right? So we're talking about a time when UNHCR is very well aware that Donald Trump could basically eliminate or most of UNHCR's operating budget, like with a tweet, right? So they're very worried about maintaining their reputation as sort of a non-political, non-threatening force of good in the world. So I came up with my answer to the question, why is UNHCR so committed to the binary as a kind of operational ideology? And I found that UNHCR is concerned, really concerned about the populist turn in donor states. They're highly motivated to protect their authority on refugee issues so that they can stay relevant. So that when someone's curious or wondering and they Google refugees, UNHCR is the first hit. They do a ton of work to make sure they're the first hit when you Google this issue. Because they want to maintain their capacity to assist vulnerable people. They want to stay, right? They want to stay existing for self-preservation purposes, but also for the purposes of doing the work that they feel is very important. To do this, they insist on the particularity of the refugee. And this particularity is very appealing because it reassures the majority of voters in donor states that refugees aren't a threat, because our obligations to refugees do not extend to every border crosser. So you don't have to be in favor of open borders. You don't have to be a big advocate who's like, no, everything we're doing at the border, all these border protection measures are harsh. You can believe in that. You can believe in borders and state sovereignty and still want to protect refugees. And this is very important for UNHCR because they're more likely to convince people of that position than the more radical position. So in sum, binary logic helps UNHCR illustrate the humanity of refugees while defining refugees as a distinctive group, not the hordes of migrants the global North public are worried about. So how does this relate to the larger argument of the book? Building empathy for refugees by insisting that they're uniquely deserving of concern and emphasizing the importance of sorting them from other border crossers has unintended consequences. It implies a lot about what our obligations are to everybody else who is not able to access that label. Such frames allow powerful states to sidestep what are the most absolutely difficult political discussions and conversations that they would have to have amongst themselves and in the public realm about the ethics of border control by suggesting that harsh measures are just so long as they're making rare exceptions for refugees. And the binary serves to assure us that real refugees are going to rise to the top of these draconian sorting processes and leave undeserving migrants below. Right? It's like almost like a remix. It's happening here. So we don't need to worry. We can sleep at night. And I guess I'm here to tell you that you probably shouldn't be sleeping very well at night. Because, and so I'll just end with what a move away from binary logic would look like, because everyone always asks me that. So a move away from a tug of war advocacy argument about whether or not a particular person crossing a border is a refugee. I'm trying to convince you and others that that's not a helpful way of having these conversations. If someone's convinced they're not, you're trying to say they are, all you're going to do is go back and forth. It's not a productive form of dialogue in this arena. Instead, we have to do much harder. We have to acknowledge the difficulty of the situation. We have to have difficult conversations about how much violence we, as privileged people in global North states, are willing to tolerate to protect our purpose. That's not a conversation to have. That's much harder than assuming the definition has already done all of the difficult moral work for us. We have to face up to questions of responsibility and accountability regarding the global North's role in causing displacement and causing instability through colonialism, neo-colonial global capitalism, and military intervention. Instead of just saying like, stuff happens in these other places, and then they just spontaneously show up here. No, that's not the story, right? It's more complicated. And finally, we have to imagine new and complementary forms of protection for people who are not going to stop coming, but who cannot actually meet the very narrow definition of a refugee under international law. So I will leave it there and just say thank you very much for having me. And I'm turning it over directly, am I? To my
I should have asked to go first because Rebecca's very difficult to follow. I wonder, so I tend to talk with my hands, so I'm going to attempt to limit my gesticulating so the mic doesn't go flying, but if it's possible for me to get a clip-on mic, that would, I think, be safer for everyone concerned as they're putting up to find the slides I'm going to be using to speak. Maybe I'll start by just saying that I'm very excited to be here because I've been giving talks about my book at various places, and all of those have been Zoom talks. So this is the first in-person book talk that I've given, and it's very nice to be doing that. Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. So one of the ways in which my work connects with Rebecca's is that one of the things that I do in my book is that I deal with, so I have the word refugees in the title of my book. And I define refugees in the book using a social scientific definition.
because I recognize that the designation of individuals as refugees is a political act. And I'm actually interested in the book in trying to figure out why it is that governments treat different groups of people differently. I'm also interested in the role of the UN Refugee Agency. And so you'll see some connections to Rebecca's work there as well. Can I suggest that you open it in Adobe, because that way I'll be able to click through? So the book, the title of which will appear here shortly, I hope, is called Discrimination and Delegation, Explaining State Responses to Refugees. And if you click Control-L, it should go to full screen. And this book came out this February. It was published by Oxford University Press. It is based on my doctoral dissertation. And I'm going to try to give you sort of an overview of the argument and a little glimpse of some of the evidence that I've collected. Great, thank you so much. I'm going to try out the clicker and see if it, yep. Okay, so I'm going to start with this observation that various people have made, but that is stated here very well by someone called Catherine Deverne. And the observation is basically this idea that migration has become the last bastion of sovereignty. And what this notion means is that in general, countries in the face of globalization have been willing to open up their borders to flows of goods and to financial flows, but population flows is where they've put their foot down, right? And this kind of intuition may sound very persuasive to you if you follow recent and current events. So this here is an image of the Italian Coast Guard intercepting a boat carrying people from Libya who are attempting to reach the European Union. What I observe in the book is that there are a couple of problems with this logic. The first problem is that we know that governments around the world treat certain groups of refugees better than others. So the canonical example of this is what's called the Haitian-Cuban paradox in the United States, where the United States historically has been much more welcoming of Cuban refugees compared to Haitians. But this is not unique to the United States. Scholars have documented similar dynamics in India, where Tibetans were sort of received much more warmly than Sri Lankan and Bangladeshi refugees, and in Costa Rica, where Nicaraguans were welcome, whereas Salvadorans were not. I call this the discrimination puzzle, and it kind of starts to chip away at this idea of migration as the last bastion of sovereignty. The governments are sort of picking and choosing between different groups, admitting some and rejecting others. The second problem with this notion of migration as the last bastion of sovereignty is what I call the delegation puzzle. Basically, there are a number of countries around the world where if you apply for refugee status, your application is going to be decided jointly by the government of that country and by the UN Refugee Agency. So on this map are shaded 23 countries where in 2011, you had this joint refugee status determination process. In that year, there were even more countries shaded here in blue, 54 countries, where if you applied for refugee status, your application was going to be decided on solely by the UN Refugee Agency. This is very striking. This means that there are a number of governments around the world that have basically given the UN the power to decide who gets refugee status, and therefore who gets access to all the privileges that are associated with that status. And these include countries that are usually very protective of their sovereignty, like India, countries that certainly have the resources to conduct refugee status determination themselves if they want to, like Saudi Arabia, right? So this delegation puzzle is sort of the other problem, I argue, with this notion of migration as the last bastion of sovereignty. And what my task in the book is to try to figure out what explains patterns in discrimination and delegation. So I argue that if we want to understand why it is that governments treat different refugee groups the way they do, we need to pay attention to two levels, an international level and a domestic level. At the international level, I argue that governments in refugee receiving states are paying attention to their bilateral relationship with the government of the country those refugees are coming from. And in general, refugee receiving states are going to be more welcoming to refugees if they are coming from a hostile state for a variety of reasons. Welcoming refugees from arrival can be a way to destabilize that country or to impose reputational costs on it, or potentially to even harbor people who can engage in cross-border attacks. Governments would not want to impose these costs on friendly refugee sending countries, and so they're more likely to be restrictive towards those refugee groups. So that's the international level. At the domestic level, I argue that policymakers in refugee receiving countries are paying attention to the identity of refugee groups and whether or not they feel that they share some sort of kinship or an affinity with those refugees. So here I'm using ethnicity in a very broad sense to capture whichever cleavages are most salient in a given society. These could be linguistic or racial or religious, what have you. And in general, policymakers would want to be more welcoming towards refugees whom they perceive to be ethnic kin for a variety of reasons, right? They could be just pandering to what their constituency wants, and we know that in general, people tend to be more sympathetic towards others that they perceive as sharing their identity. In multi-ethnic societies, policymakers could be sort of concerned about the ethnic balance and want to either improve it or preserve it in a way that maintains their hold on power. And finally, distinguishing between different refugee groups based on identity concerns can be a way to encourage mobilization domestically along ethnic lines in ways that may benefit policymakers. So this provides an incentive for policymakers in a refugee receiving country to be receptive of refugees or ethnic kin and less receptive to refugees or ethnic others. So in some cases, these two sets of incentives, the international one and the domestic one, are going to point in the same direction, right? So if refugees are coming from a rival state and they're ethnic kin, policymakers can generally be welcoming of them. If they're coming from a friendly state and they're ethnic others, policymakers can generally shut them out. But in some cases, these incentives are going to push in opposite directions. And I argue that when these incentives conflict, that is when we see governments delegate or outsource refugee policy to the UN Refugee Agency or UNHCR. And UNHCR is perfect for this role, right? When you delegate to it, it allows you to avoid antagonizing either refugee sending countries or domestic constituencies. And UNHCR looks, it's insulated from lobbying. It looks neutral to outside observers, but at the same time, UNHCR is very, very easy for governments to punish if it oversteps, right? The UNHCR can only operate on a country's territory with its consent, and so governments can kick UNHCR out if it behaves in ways they don't like. But even short of that, there are cases of governments simply stationing police officers around UNHCR offices so that asylum seekers are unable to physically access the office to file their asylum claims. UNHCR knows that it is vulnerable to punishment in these ways, and so it may self-censor the kinds of critiques that it raises. Policymakers in refugee receiving countries also know that UNHCR is perpetually understaffed and underfunded. It's only going to be able to assist limited numbers of refugees anyway. And also that even if a policymaker were to hand over to the UN decision-making over asylum applications or say responsibility for managing a refugee camp, it's still the policymaker who has control over a whole range of other policy decisions, such as what happens at the border, or do people have access to the labor market? So this table summarizes my argument, right? Well, in general, when refugees are coming from a hostile state and they're perceived as co-ethnics, I expect to observe an inclusive asylum policy. When they are coming from a friendly state and they're ethnic others, I expect to observe a restrictive policy. And then on the cross diagonal there, you see where it is that I expect to see delegation to the UN. And I'll clarify that when I'm talking about asylum policy, I'm thinking not just about entry, right? Not just about whether people who appear at the border are allowed to enter a country, but also about things like what sort of legislation is passed. Do people have freedom of movement? Are they detained? Are they deported? Do they have access to the formal labor market, et cetera? So in order to try to test my argument, I adopt in the book what I call a 3-stage multi-level research design. Basically, the idea here is that each step is supposed to corroborate and expand on the one that comes immediately before it. So first, I present a cross-country statistical regression on refugee status determination around the world and over a number of years. And this is nice because it helps me to provide some evidence that my argument in general seems to hold over space and over time. But it is limited because I'm only looking at the piece that has to do with refugee status. And I just said that I think of asylum policy much more broadly, right? So in the second stage, I present 2 case studies of countries who are refugee receiving, Egypt and Turkey. And here I'm able to look at a wider range of policies and compare how it is that these governments treated different refugee groups on their territory over time. Finally, I present a content analysis of parliamentary proceedings in Kenya. And that helps me get at how it is that domestic actors within that country are speaking about different refugee groups and how it is that the statements of legislators may differ, for example, depending on which constituency they represent. So the 3 countries I mentioned are Egypt, Turkey, and Kenya. And I characterize Egypt as a typical refugee recipient. It's typical in the sense that in the period that I'm studying, it has a relatively low number of refugees per capita. This is similar to most countries in the world, right? It has ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention. That makes it representative as well. Turkey, I characterize as an outlier for various reasons that I'll get to in a bit. And Kenya is generally considered a crucial case in the field of refugee studies because Kenya hosts one of the largest refugee camps in the world and is home to a protracted refugee situation with the Somalis. I was very careful in my book to focus my case studies on global South countries. And the reason that I do this is because most of the literature that we have on immigration and asylum policy focuses on the global North. That is not where most of the world's refugees reside, right? 85% of the world's refugees live in the global South. These 3 countries are very different from each other, right? They vary in terms of their political regime, in terms of their economic conditions. They vary in terms of their refugee policies as well. And so if I'm able to find, as I do, the same patterns across all 3, this gives me confidence that my argument may hold elsewhere as well. And finally, these 3 countries share some of the same refugee groups. And so part of what I'm able to do is I'm able to hold the refugee group constant and compare how single refugee groups, say like the Sudanese, are treated in Egypt versus in Kenya. So for my research, I traveled to all 3 countries, conducted interviews with a whole range of different actors. I also consulted documents in various different collections in Cairo, at Oxford, and also in Nairobi. I went to Geneva to the UNHCR archives and gathered over 6,000 pages of archival material in English, French, and Arabic primarily. And then I created a comprehensive database of every single time someone in the Kenyan parliament said the word asylum or refugee or the Swahili root word kimbi. So I'm not going to show you all of this evidence that I've collected, right? But I do find in the book that a lot of this evidence seems to provide support to my argument. I'm just going to give you sort of a glimpse of some of this evidence here by focusing on some of the refugee groups in Turkey, which is one of the cases that I look at. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that Turkey is, or I characterize it as an outlier. And the reason I consider it an outlier is because it is one of a handful of countries that maintains what is called a geographical limitation to the 1951 Refugee Convention. What this means is that as a matter of law, Turkey only recognizes Europeans for refugee status. Turkey is also an outlier in that it has experienced multiple mass refugee influxes with the Iraqi Kurds, Bulgarian Turks, Bosnians, and Kosovars, and most recently with the Syrians. So the conventional wisdom on Turkey and most of the literature on that country is that the main dichotomy is between Europeans and non-Europeans. That because of the geographical limitation that Turkey has, that it generally treats Europeans well and non-Europeans poorly. What I find is that the patterns are actually much more nuanced and much more complicated, and they seem to align much more closely with my theoretical expectations. So I'm going to focus here on just a few of the groups that I look at in that case. So this table at the top tells you what my theoretical expectations are for each of these groups. So starting with Bulgarians. So in the late 1980s, about 300,000 Bulgarians fled Bulgaria, headed to Turkey to flee very repressive assimilation policies that were being forced on them by the Bulgarian government. At the time, Turkey and Bulgaria were on opposite sides of the Cold War. Their relationship between them was decidedly hostile, right? And these Bulgarians were ethnically Turkish. And so Turkish policymakers perceived them as ethnic kin. And so my theoretical expectation is that this group would be welcomed. And they actually are, right? So in response to this very large number of Bulgarians, right, 300,000, Turkey decided to suspend its visa requirement. And it provided these people with access to government housing, access to employment, and the ability to apply for Turkish citizenship. At the bottom of the screen here, you see a snippet from the UNHCR archives. These are UNHCR officials noting that there is a striking discrepancy between the favorable position of refugees who are of Turkish ethnic origin and the aid that's given to them compared to the treatment of non-ethnically Turkish refugees in Turkey. Interestingly, once communism collapses and the relationship between Turkey and Bulgaria shifts to a friendlier relationship, Turkey actually starts deporting Bulgarian Turkish refugees, and they are no longer eligible to apply for visas. So compare the way that Turkey initially responds to this very massive refugee movement to the way that Turkey responded to the Iraqi Kurds who arrived in that country around the same time, in the late 1980s. So in the late 1980s, tens of thousands of Iraqi Kurds were fleeing Saddam Hussein's Al-Anfal campaigns. The relationship between Turkey and Iraq at the time was very friendly and featured extensive economic ties. And at the same time, because these people were ethnic Kurds, Turkish policymakers certainly perceived them as ethnic others. And so my theoretical prediction would be that this group would experience restrictive treatment, which is what happens, right? So in striking contrast to the way that the Bulgarian Kurds were treated, the Bulgarian Turks were treated, the Iraqi Kurds are immediately restricted to camps. These camps are heavily guarded, they're closely monitored. There are offers of international assistance, which Turkey declines, right? And ultimately it pushes back these people into Iraq at the first opportunity that it is afforded. At the bottom of the screen here, you see a snippet from the UNHCR archives. This is a letter by Iraqi refugees in Turkey that is addressed to the UN High Commissioner, where they're complaining that they're unable to get any legal status in Turkey. They're constantly attacked by the police and security day and night. They're ill-treated even if they try to provide documentation. So these two very large groups arrive in Turkey at around the same time. They're treated in very, very different ways. And Turkey is actually more welcoming of the much larger refugee group, which is the Bulgarian Kurds. Sorry, Bulgarian Turks, excuse me. The final group that I want to talk about are Bosnians. So in the early to mid 1990s, Turkey receives about 20,000 people who are fleeing the Bosnia War. At the time where the relationship between Turkey and Yugoslavia is very tense, and Turkish policymakers do not consider the Bosnians to be ethnic kin. So my theoretical prediction is that Turkey would turn over responsibility for the Bosnians to the UN, which it does, right? So unlike the very welcoming treatment that the Bulgarian Turks received, and also unlike the very restrictive treatment that the Iraqi Kurds received, the Bosnians are designated as guests by the Turkish government. They're permitted to reside wherever they like, including in urban areas. They're not restricted to camps. But for this group, Turkey solicits and receives massive assistance from the UN Refugee Agency, which is tasked with helping Bosnian refugees. At the bottom, here's another snippet from the UNHCR archives. This is an internal memo from officials at the UNHCR Turkey office to headquarters, UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. And in this letter, UNHCR Turkey officials are explaining that in their dealings with the Turkish government, they have learned to avoid using the words mandate and the word refugee. So imagine, this is called the UN Refugee Agency. They're unable to use the word refugee when they're talking with the Turkish government, because in the past, this word has provoked a negative reaction, and they actually refer to self-censorship that UNHCR has been engaged in. So to sum up, it really looks like Turkey's asylum policies, just looking at these three groups, they don't fit neatly within a European, non-European dichotomy, which is the conventional wisdom on this case, right? Bosnians who ought to be considered European are not, immediately welcomed. And instead, it looks like the group-specific variation in Turkey's asylum policies is consistent with my argument. There's also no evidence that Turkey's responses to these various groups were shaped by humanitarianism. So for example, both the Bulgarian Turks and the Iraqi Kurds were minorities who were fleeing persecution, and yet they're treated in very, very different ways. It doesn't seem as though Turkey is selecting those refugees who are more highly educated or who are more skilled for its labor market. Turkey actually winds up being more accepting of the larger refugee movement, right? And at the same time, it doesn't seem as though the results, it doesn't seem as though these patterns are the result of just day-to-day individual decisions that are being made by low-level bureaucrats in Turkey. So to conclude, in the book, I argue that foreign policy and ethnic politics shape whether countries will welcome refugees, exclude them, or shift the burden to the United Nations. As I argue in the book, there are implications for scholarship on these topics. Refugee reception, particularly in the global South, is understudied. And the question of delegation to UNHCR, as far as I know, is completely unstudied besides my book, right? But it is a very puzzling phenomenon. And so my book contributes to various literatures, including the literature on the politics of migration and asylum, the literature on responses to globalization, and also the literature on international human rights. There are implications for policy as well. So if you buy my argument, then that means that the United Nations and also various NGOs need to recognize that there are certain groups that are going to be mistreated by governments for structural reasons, right? And so they need to really target their advocacy and assistance towards those particular groups. And also, concerned states in the international community need to recognize that there are going to be some cases in which exerting pressure is not going to be enough, and they need to use other tools like resettlement instead. So this here is just an image of the book cover and my table of contents, so you get a sense of how the book is structured. I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussant comments and then to hearing questions and comments from you all. Thank you.
Thanks so much to our two presenters. Is this mic working? Can you hear me in the back? Okay, great, thank you. So wonderful, two fantastic presentations. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamlin, Dr. Abdelaaty. With this, we're going to move first to our two expert discussants, and then we will open to Q&A. So please keep your questions in your minds, and we'll be coming to you soon. But first, I want to
just clarify one point from Lamis before we go on, please.
We're going to wait and move to our discussants first, and then we welcome questions from the audience. Thank you.
It's not question, it's clarification.
and we will welcome all the audience participation after the discussants. So first I want to introduce our two discussants. We're going to begin with Dr. Ian Kysel, who is a visiting assistant clinical professor of law at Cornell. He is the founder and director of the Transnational Disputes Clinic and of the International Migrants Bill of Rights Initiative. And he co-directs the Asylum and Convention Against Torture Appellate Clinic and is a core faculty member in the Migrations and Human Rights Program here at Cornell University. He recently co-founded the Global Strategic Litigation Council for Refugee Rights and sits on its steering committee. The council secretariat is jointly housed at Cornell and the New School's Zolberg Institute, where he is a non-resident fellow. His scholarship has focused on both the rights of migrants and children's rights. And Kysel has argued or participated in litigation before international tribunals, as well as US immigration, federal and state courts. He has also provided testimony to various legislative bodies and commissions, and he was previously a staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California. Dr. Chiara Galli is a scholar of international migration, refugee studies, law and society, and childhood. She is currently the Klarman Postdoctoral Fellow at Cornell University, and she received her PhD in sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles in 2020. Two sets of questions guide her research. First, she is interested in the political and legal struggles that lie at the heart of classifying migration flows and in how legal status works as an axis of inequality to stratify the immigrant experience. Second, she's interested in how children and youth differ from adults as independent migratory actors and legal subjects in their own right. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and published in the journals Social Problems, Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and Ethnic and Racial Studies, as well as in book chapters, policy reports, and op-eds. Her forthcoming book from the University of California Press is an ethnographic study of the experiences and perspectives of Central American unaccompanied minors and their immigration attorneys as they pursue applications for refugee status in the US asylum process. Ian Kysel, we'll start with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Riedel, and thank you to the Migrations Initiative for organizing this fabulous event. Dr. Abdelaaty and Dr. Hamlin, thank you so much for your scholarship and your presentations. It's really an honor to participate in this forum as a discussant and share the stage with so many distinguished scholars. I feel compelled, therefore, to start with the caveat that my training is as a lawyer, and much of my work has been as a lawyer and litigator, and also as a clinician at the law school where I teach students the practice of law. I've researched and written on the rights of people on the move, of course, but whatever the virtues be of cross-disciplinary dialogue, I will inevitably fail to highlight the disciplinary contributions of some of our colleagues. Dr. Abdelaaty, I won't comment on the model in your book, for example, but I want to, so I'll primarily focus on discrimination and delegation. I do want to briefly touch Dr. Hamlin on crossing and closing. If I have a moment. As an initial matter, I just want to underscore that these texts really are great contributions to the field. I so enjoyed reading them. And I had a chance just yesterday in chatting with colleagues at UNHCR to promote the insights in the books. They're really practically relevant, and I commend them both to you. Professor Abdelaaty, I think you've written the definitive work persuasively establishing a causal mechanism here that explains some really key puzzles in refugee policy, why states differentiate between groups of refugees and vest UNHCR with this responsibility to carry out so many different aspects of refugee protection, such as camp management, refugee status determination. And I want to just begin engaging the first puzzle. As a lawyer, of course, the relevance of the international law prohibition on discrimination struck me immediately, as just in reading the title. But as an important, I think it opens up an important contribution by implication. And so I just want to briefly highlight this intersection with this body of law. Of course, as many of you will know, the UN Charter sets out four purposes for the United Nations, encouraging essentially respect for human rights and non-discrimination without distinction for race, sex, language, or religion. A couple of years later, the Universal Declaration widens the grounds of discrimination and provides that people have the right to seek and enjoy asylum without discrimination, including discrimination on the basis of national origin. As Professor Hathaway has observed in his work, these general international human rights obligations place restrictions on the ability of states to discriminate among and between refugees, at least as a matter of international law. They must justify the distinctions. And as a matter of refugee law, at least at a high level, the states that are parties to the Refugee Convention have signed on to its Article 3, which prohibits the discrimination between refugees on the basis of race, religion, or national origin. So there's really no government objective that can justify deprivation of refugee rights on account of national origin. It's just a flat prohibition in the convention. And I begin by that because I read this book as making an important contribution, establishing a compelling account of why states consistently or regularly violate this provision of refugee and international human rights law. As the case study chapters show in great detail, what's defined as asylum policy by reference to a number of provisions of refugee law. It doesn't focus on non-discrimination as an aspect of refugee policy, but the substantive findings would seem to establish that Egypt, Turkey, and Kenya have consistently violated that provision of the convention. Of course, there may be a sort of deeper grained discussion of non-discrimination in the book that I missed, but I really see discrimination functioning not in a legal way, unlike perhaps other sensitivity to legal categories. And so I think perhaps it's a bit of an omission to not treat the legal dimensions of that key aspect of or key puzzle. But I highlight this intersection because to me, it's really interesting and shows how this study might help reframe kind of the violation of refugee law away from the right of access to territory. And this is a sort of an aspect of the literature that the book takes on. The book notes that much of the focus of the criticism of global refugee regimes is focused particularly on global northern states, on the so-called non-entree regimes, and with implications for the right to non-refoulement, the right against return to harm. Of course, we only have to look at the COVID pandemic, state border closures, and the number of states that did not include an exception for asylum seekers to see that that's still a very important aspect of engaging refugee policy. But I think this book really amplifies the degree to which we can see refugee rights as human rights and refugee protection as a fight against racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. I think in that sense, it's a really powerful treatment of that issue. So next, I want to engage with the second puzzle, delegation. What a powerful framing of this role of UNHCR given by states in this exercise of selective sovereignty. And I read the book to suggest that the expulsion of refugees is an exercise of sovereignty. There's some suggestion, I think, that perhaps welcoming refugees or ceding refugee protection functions to UNHCR are illustrations of sovereignty's absence. Sometimes I read the book to suggest that UNHCR, that delegation to UNHCR engages this sovereignty puzzle as an abdication of sovereignty. But turning to the evidence, I would have expected that Kenya's encampment policy would have then been the strongest argument for this. But I was just so struck by a few of the quotes from Kenyan government officials that cut in some ways in another direction. The book cites a warning from the Kenyan government that state mandated movement of refugees from two camps to another. There's a whole more complicated and beautifully treated case study here that we didn't hear about in the talk. But suffice it to say, the government mandates the movement of refugees from two camps to another and says it's a cabinet decision and not negotiable to UNHCR. And then the next year in 1993, a state mandated closure of a camp, again, non-negotiable. And the book notes that the Kenyan government was in full control of encampment in important respects, location, provision of land, which camps remained open. Of course, to me, this reads as an assertion of sovereignty, not a selective engagement of sovereignty. And one might also see the welcoming of refugees as an exercise of sovereignty, at least for countries who have signed on to the Refugee Convention and therefore have an obligation to protect them. And putting my lawyer hat back on, the international legal responsibility of international organizations has been a significantly important topic in the international law field in recent years. For anybody who followed the UN's introduction of cholera into Haiti, you may have followed some of this controversy. Professor Clabbers has recently written that it's a topic of bewildering complexity, so I will just keep it very brief. Suffice it to say that the International Law Commission has articulated in its articles on the international responsibility of international organizations that essentially international organizations with legal personality can be held responsible for wrongful acts. But as a matter of doctrine, most violations in which an international organization might be involved, I'll try to avoid legal terms like complicit, but are often under the international law doctrine still violations of the state. So to me, I think that might be just yet another interesting area to explore this theory of selective sovereignty, where you have this differentiation between UNHCR really acting like a government and UNHCR acting in ways that still leave the government legally responsible for that. I was in a related way struck by the fact that the Kenyan government didn't ever explicitly agree to respect UNHCR refugee status determination decisions. It made me wonder about some of the variation in the RSD landscape when UNHCR is exercising this adjudication role. Another example from the book, as I read it under the 1994 asylum regulations, the Turkish government essentially adjudicated first whether someone was a genuine asylum seeker and then referred in many cases the case for adjudication by UNHCR for largely resettlement purposes. And yet the government, rounded up at various points, including in March of 1997, 600, a mix of genuine asylum seekers and recognized refugees for deportation. To me, this sort of intersection with the delegation of the RSD function and this question of sovereignty, some of these examples raise questions about just what is being delegated. There are a couple of places in the book where the study frames RSD as an admission decision, and even in the context of UNHCR sort of mandate RSD talks about an international organization determining who can remain. I'm, of course, and who's admitted, of course, not aware of any case where UNHCR is actually standing at the border in place of the state. I'm not sure that the agency would ever accept that delegation, but it's fascinating that this book suggests that in some cases a state might want to make that delegation, which leads me to sort of the last aspect of this second puzzle that I want to discuss, which is sort of this issue of registration. So in every place that UNHCR is doing a refugee status determination, or at least in most states, there's a separate, in many cases, a separate registration of an asylum seeker before an eventual refugee status determination. And I see, or I understand UNHCR policy to have shifted somewhat in recent years. So in 2016, UNHCR articulated a new strategic direction on refugee status determination and talked about circumstances in which such determinations shouldn't be carried out when an individual is assured of all the safeguards of refugee status, including protection from return, access to rights, of course, query whether there's ever a place where that's going to actually be true, but operatively, I suspect that the agency is applying that definition, even in cases, some of the circumstances that are similar to the case studies that we heard about today and that are discussed more in the book. I understand UNHCR to in a number of places reduced reliance on RSD as a result. So in 2016, which is really the height of UNHCR refugee status determinations, there were 2.8 million global RSDs, about 5% of them done by UNHCR, about 156,000, but there were about 230,000 applications for refugee status lodged. So they're not adjudicating all of them, registering more than they're adjudicating, and that trend, I think, follows. Dr. Claire Walke has described registration as an almost entirely forgotten function in the literature, and so I raise that because I think both this change in UNHCR policy and this, this function of registration raises another area where the theory could be extended to think about what exactly is being delegated in the context of registration. How is UNHCR functioning? Of course, regardless of what work UNHCR thinks it's doing, is UNHCR reacting implicitly to exactly the mechanism that the book identifies and trying to create a little bit more political space? In any event, a fabulous book. It was really an honor to try to provide some further thoughts. I can't wait to continue the discussion. I just want to close with one reflection for you, Professor Hamlin. As I said at the beginning, I think it's a really important book. I hope you've sent a copy to everyone at UNHCR DIP, the kind of policy function, because I completely agree and am often concerned that the insistence on the binary raises significant protection concerns that, essentially the agency is setting itself or setting migrants' rights up for substantial violation in the future by insisting on the binary. Apologies to any UNHCR colleagues who are watching for my unbridled and undiplomatic language, but so my sort of critique or my yes, but there's really just one sentence in the book where you say, attorneys and other advocates who are working within existing frameworks absolutely do need to accept the binary for those purposes, even as they may be working to stretch the refugee definition. I don't really want to push back on that per se, but I don't think you should let lawyers off so easily. I say this as a litigator, but a litigator who recognizes that I haven't consistently done this, but I think it's worth pushing even lawyers. Lawyering and writing briefs, at least for litigators, is a storytelling function. We use frames in our storytelling, including the binary. And I think strategic litigators that tell the story of their cases should be pushed to think about the binary, even as they might be applying, of course, as the quote actually addresses, the legal definition of a refugee. And I was looking and sort of pleasantly surprised at Kysel, which is the kind of most well-known piece of litigation challenging the Title 42 border expulsions, the sort of arcane public health authority that's been used to push back Haitians and many other migrants, more than 1 million. I say migrants. I'll say migrants for the purpose of this discussion, humans arriving at the southern United States border that do not have a visa or another vehicle to make an authorized entry. And the litigation in the initial complaint uses the term vulnerable families, which I thought was quite interesting. And that's been fairly consistent messaging in some of the press releases, notwithstanding some of the co-counsel criticizing the administration to treat refugees like political pawns. So it's not uniformly the case in the litigation team. But I just wanted to encourage you not to let litigators off the hook, and thank you both for your contribution.
Everyone hear me? Strange, speaking into a microphone. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with these two great authors, and I so enjoy reading and thinking about these. So for the purposes of time, I'll be focusing my comment on Dr. Hamlin's book, Crossing, which is a provocative book that I keep coming back to as I think about my own research, which looks at asylum seekers, but also asylum lawyering in the US context. And I'm not a lawyer, but I have some skills. So in her book, Dr. Hamlin pushes scholars, advocates, and policymakers to move beyond the migrant refugee binary, which she argues is a dangerous legal fiction, as she said, that serves to make harsh border control seem justifiable, and that does not reflect lived experiences of migration. So I'll begin by highlighting what I see as two of the really key contributions of the book. First, Dr. Hamlin exposes the little-known history, both leading up to and after the 1951 Refugee Convention. And she shows us that the creation of the refugee definition was a contentious process that took place in the context of a world of unequal sovereignties, colonialism, and then decolonization struggles. And I thought that the post-1951 history leading up to the protocol, which eliminated the geographic restrictions on refugee eligibility, to be really compelling and underexplored by previous scholarship. Dr. Hamlin shows us that countries in the global south have always found the refugee definition too narrow and not protective of groups of political and humanitarian interest to them, such as, she said, freedom fighters seeking to dismantle colonial regimes in Africa. Hamlin argues that it is these contentious power dynamics in a world of Western domination and not a distaste for human rights that explains why countries in the global south have either failed to ratify the UN refugee treaties or have instead, or in addition, introduced their own. And in this way, she highlights that countries in the global south aren't just producers of refugee flows, but rather they're also producers of international law. And ones that I think countries like the US would indeed do well to take as an example to reform what have become our own very problematic practices of refugee status determination and our own very narrow application of the definition.
Second, I greatly enjoyed the, can you not hear me?
Let's try again. Oh. Secondly, I really enjoyed the sweeping critique of the boundary work that is being done to uphold the refugee category as one that is separate from that of migrant. And as Dr. Hamlin showed us in her presentation, the work of UNHCR is especially salient in that kind of boundary work. And note that this is in opposition to different approaches, such as the one taken by the International Organization for Migration, which instead considers migrant to be an umbrella term for all people who cross borders, international migrant, and then refugee fits under that broader umbrella. And I think that this is also the social scientific approach to the study of migration, and refugee flows as a distinct type of international migration. But Dr. Hamlin also shows us that this boundary work is being done not only by the UNHCR, but also by the kind of classic refugee studies scholarship that was born at the University of Oxford, that's really mirrored and reified the stance of the UNHCR, and in this way has transferred the binary refugee category to the realm of scholarly analysis. And in her book, Dr. Hamlin rightly argues, like others also have done, that the field of refugee studies has been harmed by its isolation from the broader research in the social science on international migration. Now, I agree that with Dr. Hamlin that the binary is simplistic and problematic, but I want to shift gears a little bit and push back on this idea that we should do away with refugee altogether as a category of analysis for scholarly purposes and as a category that might be helpful for advocates as a legal category. As opposed to, for example, considering migrants as this umbrella term and then fitting refugee under that by identifying that refugees may have some distinct characteristics. So Dr. Hamlin writes, everything that we know about people who decide to move suggests that their motivations and experiences are more complicated than a binary or even a continuum can capture. So this is an intervention as in theory, theories of population movements. And I agree that these are ways to simplify our understandings of population movements, but I also think that the purpose of theory is to simplify a complex social world. And as migration scholars, we're seeking to understand, explain, and theorize the motivations and dynamics of population movements. So I wanted to ask the author if the word she uses, border crosser, is meant to be a category of analysis for scholars, and if so, how it helps us explain migratory dynamics. And I know that some work in the social sciences and my own work, we use, like Dr. Abdelaaty was saying, refugee as a social science definition, which is usually a person who escapes from violence or life-threatening violence. And there's been some work following David Fitzgerald and Rowan Arar, two sociologists, that's encouraged scholars to apply theories of international migration to explain population movements from contexts of violence. And something that's quite interesting by some new scholarship is that they've actually found observable differences between flows from countries characterized by violence and labor migration. So next, and thinking more of the contributions of the book to theory, Dr. Hamlin writes that scholars often give it as a taken that destination states have the right to keep people out. And she says, quote, moving beyond the binary forces us to admit, as she said during her presentation, that borders do violent work and that none of that violence is easily justified. Now, I think that for critical migration scholars who work with undocumented immigrants and those with temporary statuses primarily, the argument that migrants have rights irrespective of why they left their homes and deserve humane treatment is not very surprising. And so in line with the book's theme that refugee and migration studies should be in conversation, I was hoping that the author could link her work to the critical migration scholarship on legal violence developed by Cecilia Menjivar and Leicia Brego. And so these sociologists use this concept of legal violence to describe the dehumanizing nature of immigration enforcement targeting all categories of border crossers, precisely to highlight the violent work that borders do and to really problematize this idea that states can and should exclude immigrants.
And in reading and thinking more about how these different lines of scholarship intersect, it reminded me also on scholarship on the exclusion that's achieved through family reunification law, because family reunification law defines the family in a very specific way to include some members but exclude others who are members of extensive kin networks who might not fit the Western nuclear idea of family but may nonetheless be important members of a family, right? So I make these comments so we can think together about ways in which we can better link as scholars the refugee studies and migration studies literatures. And I think that a key contribution of both of these fields that take a critical approach is to highlight that all systems of state selection are discriminatory by definition because they include some groups and exclude others, or as Dr. Hamlin eloquently states in her book, quote, in an unequal world, all border regimes serve to uphold global inequality and hence can hardly be characterized as just. And I think that she makes a compelling case that border policy should be based on an honest accounting of global North responsibility for producing refugee flows, rather than on an evaluation of the deservingness of different groups of border crossers. And it seems to me that such an approach can and actually has been used to make claims not just for refugees, but also to promote, for example, family reunification. So in the US, advocates have argued that the parents who were separated from their children at the border under the Trump administration should be admitted to the US and granted legal status as a form of reparations for the past harms that US policy inflicted on them. Finally, just to defend a little bit the work of the asylum lawyers that I follow in my own research, I do think that the refugee category still has some merits in the real world in the sense of refugee law. I think that in your last book, Dr. Hamlin, Let Me Be a Refugee, you show how advocates have been able to expand refugee law beyond its original intent, particularly in the particular social group eligibility grounds, to make more refugees fit under the definition and to especially protect victims of domestic violence in Canada and in the US. And it seems to me that the three policy solutions that you cite in the conclusion of your book are not in fact doing away with the refugee category, but rather all examples of expanding the refugee definition. Well, these are the non-refoulement commitment that prohibits states from returning people who fear for their lives in their home countries, and the Cartagena and African Organization for Unity refugee definitions, which are much more expansive than the refugee definition that we use in the US. So it seems to me that these are all really important advocacy strategies that have to do more with stretching than with doing away with the category. And then Dr. Hamlin notes in her book that advocates would do better to recognize and protect border crossers as people. And I was wondering if she meant in the sense that because they have human rights. And I was thinking more about the fact that I always think about asylum as a human right, and it's recognized as one in the International Declaration of Human Rights. So my question is, why can't advocates use asylum in a human rights framework as one more tool to obtain rights and protections for non-citizens who would otherwise be excluded? And then I'll make one last point because I think we're running out of time. In the conclusion, Dr. Hamlin states that we would have a better immigration admission system if it were based not so much on finding real refugees, but rather on an assessment of humanitarian need. So I wanted to ask the author how she would define a humanitarian need or humanitarian interest. And I also wanted to note that I think that policy has really moved beyond the refugee migrant binary in this sense, because we have dozens of humanitarian admissions categories. In the US, there are protections for battered women, abandoned children, victims of crime, which are all not based on the refugee experience. In Europe, there are protections for unaccompanied minors, for people who fled and have humanitarian interests but don't fit the definition. And I could go on. So Dr. Hamlin, what is your assessment of these legal frameworks? Are these policies better or inherently different than refugee law? And if these approaches are also inadequate, what legal frameworks would you use instead? And I pose all these questions because these are the questions that I'm thinking about in my research every day. Thank you so much to both of the authors for their wonderful books.
Okay, great. So I know we're over time. So I just want to thank all of our presenters. going for a few minutes to welcome questions and comments from the audience, and I'll put some questions. So we'll just go over by a little bit. Of course, those of you who have asked are welcome to do so. So if we can have Lamis and Rebecca come up here to the front, and then I'll take questions. We'll take questions from the audience. And I'll also pose a few questions from the chat, and then we'll give you a chance to respond to everything all in one, all of the answers that we want to know. Great. So from the audience, yes, here.
Thank you both for interesting research and presentations. My question, I don't know if Dr. Abdelaaty could pull that special slide that I wanted to clarify, but I could point to it. It's the slide that talks about discrimination versus delegation, and then on the other axle is the ethnicity, ethnic infinity versus conflict and things like that. Now, I know that you only focused on the global south in your research at this moment, but it's very interesting to relate the both research, both Dr. Hamlin and your research that is relating theory to practice. And I'm specifically interested in how do you address the reality that Canada accepted over 60,000 Syrian refugees, even though did not have ethnic infinity with the Syrians, versus the shameless US policy in accepting 10,000 or less of those refugees. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful question. Any others from the audience before I go to the chat?
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamlin, and the Migrations Initiative for organizing this event. I wanted to ask, given the interdisciplinary frameworks that you engage in, what the implications are if you were to incorporate settler, or if you do incorporate settler colonial studies and indigenous studies, particularly given how settler colonial acts as a structure and is very much historically, materially, symbolically intertwined with what happens elsewhere in the world, and so far as post-colonial nations, particularly in the context of Syria, which is a proxy war situation, right? And interventionism there, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So yeah, and particularly insofar as this further settlement dispossession of indigenous people here that happens because of the circulatory, and what that implication insofar as decolonization, particularly if one is ostensibly looking at border imperialism through groups like no one is illegal, and yeah, the race and religion discussion and intertwining both together and perhaps even beyond fusions of the state. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Really enjoyed both of the presentations. My question is for Dr. Hamlin about this question of essentialism. And it seems to me that one of the things that might be, I haven't read the book, but it seems like from hearing from the discussants who have, that the definition of people might be a way of kind of escaping the essentialist trap. But what about authorities? Like, I'm kind of curious about how you would imagine authorities, whether that's somebody who has a legal authority or whether somebody's like an authority in the press, somebody who focuses on like a beat, the way that they would insist on some kind of essentialism or insist on like a positive valence that they're going to use in their way of approaching that issue. So that's something I'm really interested in myself, in the way they use these terms and the way that historically they might be used in a completely different way, right? Like there's a lot of old laws in the US that refer to people who are what we call fugitives as refugees from justice, right? So that would be a strange way of kind of looking at it today. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on how that might actually be approached by people who would accept your critique and then say, okay, so what do we do next?
Thank you so much. Great questions. Wonderful. I'm just going to throw in the questions from the chat while you're percolating on your responses, and a huge thanks as well to our discussants and the questions that they raised. So a few questions from the chat that I wanted to bring in. Can you both comment on how asylum seekers and climate change refugees, quote unquote, fall into this binary logic or not, how you see them in terms of your analysis, Dr. Abdelaaty as well, in terms of thinking about how other types of categories might be welcomed or not welcomed, excluded or included. Also, for Dr. Hamlin, do you think about the term forced migration? What do you think about it? As in Forced Migration Review, published by Oxford's Refugee Studies Center, and the title of many migrations degree programs or master degree programs. For Lamis, you list Iran and Pakistan among countries that have delegated refugee status determination to the UNHCR. And as we know, recent World Food Program reports and others warn of the extent of Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis. So have countries bordering states facing humanitarian crises like that of Afghanistan normally continued to delegate to UNHCR? So what do neighboring states do when they may be expecting the consequences of such humanitarian crises? Do you expect Iran and Pakistan, for example, to continue to delegate to UNHCR in the coming years? And then also a question for Dr. Hamlin. There have been quite a few critiques on UNHCR's practices of conflating numbers by speaking of displaced people, by which they include IDPs. In that sense, they seem less invested in differentiating the distinction between refugees and not refugees, and actually move away from another binary logic. So what are your thoughts on this? And then I'm just going to add one other in terms of to Lamis. How do you see kind of the acceptance of migrants more generally, if we're integrating, vis-a-vis Rebecca's book? How do you see welcome of migrants, because you're really focusing on refugees in the legal terms, as I understand it, and trying to accept versus exclude and keep that. So those are many, many questions, and I'm going to just pass it over first.
You have your mic. And I'm just going to jump in really fast. I know that people have had to leave for class, but you probably can't tell, we actually have a pretty large live audience still online. So just so you know, we're also talking to the internet. Yeah.
Thank you for staying.
That's good to know. How long should I speak for? Because those were a lot of questions.
I know, I'm going to give you 5 minutes each.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure I didn't go on and on and on. So thank you for those fantastic questions. And thank you so much for the very insightful discussant comments. I appreciate how carefully you engaged with the book. And I really am grateful for your perspective and the sort of, I think you've posed questions that I have not really thought about or haven't thought about in quite the same way. And I think that's part of the reason why these kind of interdisciplinary conversations can be so useful and fruitful. So I'm not going to try to sort of respond to everything that you've posed, but one thing that I'd like to just mention is that when this book was a dissertation, I actually wasn't using the word discrimination. I called it differential treatment. And I think it was only when I was sort of moving from dissertation to book that it occurred to me that I should really call it what it is, right? Which is discrimination, that I shouldn't necessarily hold back, right? From using this kind of language. And I think it would be, I think you're right to point out that, that the book doesn't do a lot to engage with the sort of the legal dimension of the prohibition against discrimination. And I think that that's sort of a really interesting and valuable angle that maybe something that I can work on moving forward. So thank you so much for posing that. You also pose a number of questions that have to do with sort of the role of sovereignty and whether states really are delegating, and if so, what are they delegating, et cetera. And I think that the one thing that I'll note here is that I think my view is that states make it appear as though they are abdicating sovereignty when in fact they are pulling strings behind the scenes, right? And so UNHCR may look like it's in charge, but really it's governments sort of constantly overruling it, constantly constraining it. And there are numerous examples in the book. Many of these sort of drawn from the archives are really like quite striking and eye-opening when you really pay attention to what it is that UNHCR is actually able or really unable to do on the ground. But thanks again for sort of posing that question, because that's really something that I struggled with. And I don't know that I've sort of ultimately handled it or that dealt with it sort of ultimately in a way that's completely satisfying. So it's something that I'm going to continue thinking about. On the variation between Canada and the United States in accepting Syrians, it's not something that I address in the book. I think in general in the book, I argue that in some states, ethnic cleavages may not be quite as salient, in which case we should expect the international dimension that I described to operate on its own. I haven't really thought a ton about explaining those particular cases, but I do sort of discuss how it is that when we think about Syrians in relation to the cases that I do discuss in the book, Egypt and Turkey, patterns do seem to align with my argument. And again, if you think my argument only holds for the global South and doesn't hold for the global North, I'm actually fine with that because that's where most of the world's refugees reside, right? We can be like hand-wringing about like, do I really explain Canada very well? If not, that's okay. Can you like compare how many Syrian refugees there are in Turkey versus in Canada, right? On climate change, that's something that I'm interested in looking at actually for my next book. It's not something that I engage with a lot in this book. But I think that one thing that it might change about my argument is that there aren't necessarily the same sort of reputational dynamics that are associated with admitting climate refugees. So admitting climate refugees is not necessarily as harsh a statement about the government that might be generating those individuals. I don't think bordering states always tend to delegate. We see this with Turkey and Syria. So Turkey has initially at least completely sort of blocked UNHCR from even being able to access the camps where Syrian refugees were residing. So I don't think we tend to see this in general. And then does my framework apply to migrants more generally? I think, I'm not sure, that's something that I kind of avoid taking a clear stance on in the book, but I think in general, I just want to go back and sort of clarify that in the book, I'm using refugees to cover all individuals who have left their homes because of any sort of violence and persecution, regardless of whether or not they are legally termed refugees by the state. Because again, part of what I'm interested in is the fact that in some cases, countries refuse to use this label, as in the case of the Bosnians, for example, as I spoke in Turkey. I hope I didn't go too much over the time that you allotted, but thanks again. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to address all these questions in as much detail as I would have liked. Thanks again.
Okay, so I'm also just so grateful for all of these really thoughtful interventions and questions. And there's a lot to say, but I'll try to tie some of it together. So I made a strategic decision in writing this book to try to meet various different readers where they are. And by that, I mean, literally what type of positionality they hold in terms of, are they an advocate? Are they a lawyer? Are they a scholar, et cetera, a media person? But also where they are in terms of their comfortability with some of these much more bigger critical critiques that take us to a place where we really have to question the legitimacy of borders, right? And so it was a strategic choice to try to say, if you're willing to come this far, great. If you're willing to come this far, fine, let's keep going. And I don't know how well that worked, but the questions kind of actually take me to various points on that spectrum, I think. So for example, the question about insisting on essentialism and what about people who are really having trouble or struggling with this language. I think the most modest goal I had with this book is to get people who talk and think and write about these issues to think more about how they talk and think and write about these issues and question the words that they're using and just be more clear and transparent about the way in which they are using the terms. And I think Dr. Abdelaaty does a fantastic job in her book of saying, I am using the word refugee and here is how I'm using it. Here's what it means in the book. And I think if I could just get more people to do that instead of using the words uncritically, I think our media coverage of these topics would be better. And I think scholarship on these topics would be better. That's a very modest goal, but I think that was the one I found to be most achievable. So I really went for it on that goal in the book. And I don't go as far as maybe I could have gone at the other end of the ambitious spectrum in terms of, I say in the conclusion, I really think we have to question whether borders can ever be just. But I don't go as far as saying, and therefore, can states ever be just? I could have fleshed that out more, but I think I dangle it. And for the people who are ready for that, I think it's there for them to take up. The book is very explicit about engaging with the way in which the colonial project has made the matter of sovereignty extremely uneven around the world and has destabilized places and has caused a lot of the displacement that we're interested in. So I do think that there is a pretty heavy critical, colonial lens here. Okay, so I don't know how to approach all these other questions, but I'll just say a couple more things. It's definitely not centrally located in the literature on critical migration studies and border violence, although I do cite some of that stuff and absolutely feel a very, very strong affinity to it. I think that I strategically assumed that that audience would be sympathetic and went more for the people that I thought would have more trouble with it. And so I was kind of like, you guys are cool. You don't need to necessarily, establish that I think the same ways, but maybe that wasn't as successful. I don't know, but I absolutely think of myself, as a critical migration scholar, but I was really, doubling down in the critical refugee studies world because it's newer, it's smaller, it's less cohesive, and trying to really trying to merge those two worlds. But I think I could have done more in that regard. So is border crosser a scholarly concept? That's a great question. I'd like it to be. I want it to be. I'd like to push us to use that word in a way that leaves us agnostic about why people are crossing borders until sort of much later in the process. And sometimes never taking it up because it isn't necessarily relevant to every single assessment or scholarly intervention into looking at border crossing. I do think that and I'm fine with people using the term refugee if they want to use it and they're clear about how they use it. Sometimes people now use the word and then go sorry and look at me and I'm like, that's not what I'm trying to do here. But rather, for me personally, I'm just less likely to use it than ever before. I mean, I really appreciated your comment about not letting the lawyers off. That was, I secretly don't, but I wanted to tell them, like, don't feel bad. Again, this is part of this, like, how do I bring people in thing. But the only last thing, two more really quick points. Climate change. I was very struck in my conversations with UNHCR about how much they don't want to touch that topic with a 10-foot pole and how very, very explicit they were consistently at all levels. Everyone I talked to about that is outside of our mandate. People displaced by climate change may find themselves somewhere along their journey being vulnerable enough where perhaps later they could have a claim based on an experience they have in transit, but they are not. People who are displaced by climate change are not refugees. And that's something that it seems like, I agree with you, is painting them into quite a corner, and I don't know what will happen there. And then on the question of UNHCR's numbers, the last thing I'll just say is, yes, sometimes they take a much broader approach to who their people of concern are. Sometimes they're much more specific. And I find it really interesting how that changes depending on what the audience is. And very clearly, when the audience is global North publics, the binary is key. In other contexts, it's much less important. And certainly when they're communicating with host states in the global South, sometimes that language has to go out the window. So it's not something they're 100% stuck on in every context to every audience. It's very much targeted at the people who are consumers of social media. And that really came across in my work. So it wasn't clear that it was always the way in which it was framed.
Oh. Wonderful. Thank you all to everyone's questions.
Are you doing? I just think people are local.
No, I mean, on the. Sure. That'll come through and then I get, just selfishly, I think it'll happen, it's just, you know, basically, I think. The problem with the changes here, they get like that. Otherwise, maybe didn't do that. So I think that.
I'll let you know. I might need to go to Mexico for a while. I might get stuck there.
Well, but you come up into we can connect before, before that, and I would, I don't know, did you and Justin end up